Hello, my dear friends. The 1950s in America were filled with a sense of optimism, a belief that everything would only get better, perfect housewives, sentimental trinkets, and an era defined by wholesome ideals. This backdrop is crucial to understanding the story of Ed Gein, set against the puritanical spirit of a time riddled with sexual taboos, when television networks wouldn't even show a married couple sleeping in the same bed. It's precisely why, in the 1950s United States, Ed Gein's story caused such a massive uproar. You're watching Room 13, and welcome to the Cradle of Nightmares. On August 27, 1906, Edward Theodore Gein was born in La Crosse County, Wisconsin. He was raised in the household of George and Augusta Gein, alongside his older brother Henry, born on January 4, 1902. In 1913, Augusta decided that life near La Crosse was too detrimental for her children. The Geins saved up enough money to purchase a small dairy farm about 40 miles east of La Crosse. However, for reasons unknown, they sold it in 1914 and bought another farm near the town of Plainfield. Plainfield was a remote, obscure place, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, with a population that barely reached 600 at 800 people. This part of Wisconsin was known for its inaccessibility due to swamps, often referred to as the Great Dead State. The Geins lived at a considerable distance from the town itself. When you study Ed Gein's life, you can't help but feel his complete isolation from any human society, except for the domineering presence of his religiously fanatical mother. George Gein, Ed's father, was an alcoholic who frequently found himself unemployed, which fueled his violent tendencies. He often took out his aggression on his children and wife. The family's livelihood rested almost entirely on Augusta, who ran a small grocery store to keep the household afloat. Despite her contempt for her husband, Augusta never sought a divorce due to her deeply held religious convictions. Raised in a devout Lutheran family, she came from a background that fiercely opposed anything related to sex, viewing it as filthy, sinful, and lustful. Religion was so central to Augusta Gein's life that she drastically limited Edward and Henry's interactions with the outside world, instilling in them the belief that the world beyond their home was steeped in sin and populated by the children of sinners. She kept them occupied with grueling farm work, allowing them to leave only for school. Augusta frequently read the Bible to her sons, preaching that the world was drowning in vice and that all women, except for herself, were harlots. She declared their family uniquely blessed by God. As the unchallenged authority in the household, Augusta forbade her sons from interacting with any females. Growing up under her iron rule, Ed developed deeply conflicting feelings toward his mother. On one hand, he subconsciously idolized her, seeing her as a godlike figure to be revered. On the other, at an unconscious level, he harbored growing resentment and hatred toward her. When Ed Gein was just 10 years old, he experienced his first orgasm while watching his mother and father slaughter a pig. On another occasion, Augusta caught Ed masturbating. For this sin, she scalded him with a bucket of boiling water. On April 1st, 1940, the family patriarch, George Gein, died of a heart attack. During this period, Ed's older brother Henry began increasingly distancing himself from their mother, showing signs of independence and envisioning a future for himself, and even for Ed, outside of her oppressive control. Henry was far more perceptive than Edward, and had a clear understanding of how isolated their family was from society. From 1940 to 1944, Henry grew increasingly uncomfortable under the weight of his tyrannical mother. Unable to find understanding at home, He began leaving for extended periods to seek work, deliberately choosing the most remote locations, presumably to distance himself from the constant bickering and violence within the family. For decades, the psychiatric community has debated whether sociopaths are born or made. Personally, I believe the toxic environment in the Gein household provides clear evidence that a child can be molded into a monster.
What kind of a man did you know that Ed Gein as? Well, he's rather simple-minded. What kind of a man did you know him as?
Well, a man is a nice man, just like anybody else. The only difference I'd say in the man, he seems to be a little high.
On the surface, Edward seemed completely ordinary. His classmates bullied him constantly. He had no friends and was painfully shy. But even when he tried to befriend anyone, his mother brutally punished him for associating with sinners. He had a small skin growth on his left eyelid that became a target for his classmates' mockery. In 1942, he received a draft notice for the army, but failed the medical examination. Later, some of his classmates recalled that Ed exhibited several odd behaviors, particularly that he would suddenly burst into laughter for no apparent reason, as if hearing some private joke inside his head. Despite his severely stunted social development, Edward was actually a decent student and particularly enjoyed reading lessons. However, he felt that everyone in the classroom wished him harm, a paranoia deeply instilled by his mother's influence. In 1941, Henry began a romance with a divorced single mother. He planned to move in with her, which made him increasingly concerned for his brother, as Augusta's influence over Edward had grown even stronger by then. Henry repeatedly criticized Edward's parroting of their mother's views. Though Henry tried to help his brother establish some independence, arranging odd jobs with neighbors on their fields, Augusta had woven a web of mental chains around Ed's mind, keeping him firmly on the track of her controlling doctrine. Rumors and speculation among those close to the Geins, including neighbors, suggest that family conflicts were the root cause of Henry's untimely death. According to Edward's testimony, on that fateful day, May 16, 1944, he and his brother were burning brush in a field when the flames suddenly turned on Henry, engulfing him. Ed claimed he panicked, lost sight of his brother in the fiery chaos, and decided to seek help. Among those he reached were a couple of farmers, several neighbors, and his mother. But by the time help arrived, it was too late. The fire had died down. When they searched for Henry's body, Ed unerringly chose the correct direction, heading to the opposite end of the field, unlike the farmers, and immediately found his barely burned body. This raised a logical question. What happened to Henry in the minute before the fire that left him suddenly unable to escape from the opposite side of the field? Later investigations revealed even more troubling details. Witnesses to the incident claimed that Henry's face and body showed signs of abrasions, as if he had been in a fight. Ed vehemently denied any wrongdoing, and it's quite possible that these witness testimonies were fabrications influenced by Ed Gein's later infamous bloody reputation. Were there truly signs of a beating? Can we indirectly speculate that the person who took Henry's life might have been his own brother? Unfortunately, we'll never know the definitive answer to these haunting questions, and so Ed was left alone with his mother. But Augusta was aging, and in January 1945, she suffered a stroke. Ultimately, on December 29, 1945, she passed away. No one attended her funeral, completely erasing Ed Gein from the society of his peers. He was an outcast, and Ed's world collapsed. It's reasonable to assume that this marked the beginning of his downward spiral, a psychological unraveling that eventually pushed him beyond control. Ed's mental state was likely already critical, and the circumstances following his mother's death only worsened it. Her passing meant losing the central figure of his entire life. One characteristic symptom of schizophrenia is complete indifference to personal appearance, which was evident in the horrific state of Ed's home. When authorities eventually entered the house, they found what appeared to be a reversed waste disposal system. Rather than taking trash to the dump, Ed seemed to bring everything home. His house became a symbolic representation of the chaos raging inside his mind, a complete and utter disarray. The house itself became a physical embodiment of this madness. Ed had radio receivers scattered around, though he couldn't listen to them since there was no electricity in the house. He hoarded old dentures everywhere. There was an enormous amount of chewed gum. It wasn't necessarily horrific, but it still sent chills down the spine. On the day of Augusta's funeral, Ed decisively severed ties with his past. The past where he was a dim-witted mama's boy, a victim of family violence, and a complete failure. He boarded up the door to his mother's bedroom, leaving her belongings exactly as she had left them on her final day. He confined himself to one room and the kitchen, yet deep in his subconscious, the divine image of his mother persisted. Embracing his solitude, Gein felt a strange pull towards society. His first major decision was buying a used Ford car. By 1949, he was traveling extensively across Wisconsin's roads. His primary entertainment became evenings spent in local roadside bars. Many people he encountered saw him as eccentric with an unusual sense of humor. They didn't exactly approve of him, but they considered it his quirky trademark. Occasionally, Ed would draw attention with tales of pirate raids and concentration camp stories, seasoned with his biting jokes. But none of those who shared evenings with him realized that these stories represented the entirety of Ed, the full spectrum of his inner life. After his mother's death, he eagerly devoured anatomy books, accounts of Nazi atrocities during World War II, information on exhumations, newspapers and magazines about freaks and people with abnormalities and peculiarities. He particularly loved the local newspaper's obituary section. All of this fascinated him deeply. One of the most striking symbols of 1950s culture was the abundance of dark, sexualized reading material. Among the most popular trends were horror comics, Vault of Horror, Tales from the Crypt, The Haunt of Fear, stories with gripping plots and vivid illustrations featuring the acceptable level of graphic violence for graphic novels of that era. These comics were read not just by children, but by adults too. People were drawn to exploring alternative lives in their most varied and disturbing manifestations. Naturally, numerous articles and publications described Nazi crimes, featuring horrific photographs from death camps published in widely read magazines like Life and Time. Stories of headhunters from the South Seas, 17th century grave robbers, necromancers, and corpse resurrectors equally captivated him. Gein's unassuming appearance made people see him as responsible. Despite his slight build, he was always willing to take on the dirtiest, hardest work. It's difficult to imagine that beneath this exterior hid a trait uncharacteristic of his nature, a maternal shell inherited from Augusta. This inner characteristic emerged when he spent considerable time with neighbors' children, often serving as their babysitter. Parents had no qualms about leaving their kids with him, even for extended periods. According to neighbors, interacting with children brought out different sides of Ed's personality. His insecurity faded into the background as he told the children magical stories about secret, mysterious pagan tribes, dried heads, severed limbs, violence. All of it commanded their rapt attention. These details, which helped paint a clearer picture of Gein's personality, were revealed to the local sheriff only after the suspicious discovery of female body parts in his home became public knowledge. In my opinion, this material fueled his inner world and warped perception, where he sometimes became utterly obsessed with such ideas. And eventually, he decided to bring his obsession to life. He began robbing graves. During interrogations, he confessed that he started this horrific practice about a year after his mother's death. You can feel how his desires and fantasies completely consumed him. He would head to the cemetery and dig up the corpse of a middle-aged woman who somewhat resembled his mother. He scoured obituaries, tracking recent funerals of women, then visited the graves while the earth was still fresh and unsettled. He would excavate the coffin, open it, extract the body, and meticulously restore the grave to its original condition. Then he would take the body home to fulfill all his twisted desires. Gein's most defining trait was his desperate desire to bring his mother back. He wanted to dig up her body, but when he went to the cemetery, he discovered he couldn't. Augusta had been buried in a part of Wisconsin where the sandy soil required concrete vaults for coffins. He never managed to retrieve her body, though many locals and writers claimed he slept with her corpse, which wasn't true. Curiously, Ed Gein's story could have served as perfect validation for Sigmund Freud's theories. Ed simultaneously loved and hated his mother. His sexually repressed upbringing prevented normal relationships with women, so through his gruesome procedures, he sought to uncover all the mysteries of the female body. He wanted to claim those parts he associated with the concept of womanhood. With extraordinary joy and greed, he harvested ever more parts from the deceased. He crafted a belt from nipples. He excised women's genitalia. The investigation found a box of dried vaginas, one lovingly framed in silver with a small red velvet bow. He used human leg bones to reinforce a coffee table. He sawed off the tops of skulls, scraped them clean, and used them as soup bowls, while some skulls served as coffee mugs. He upholstered chairs, an armchair, and even a lampshade with human skin. He skinned faces from corpses to use as masks. 5 noses were kept in a shoebox. Several lips were glued to curtains. He made dice from human bones. Useless remains he buried either in the original graves or on his property. Most shocking of all was the women's suit sewn together from various corpses. By stitching together skin fragments from different bodies, he created his own Frankenstein-like perception of womanhood. Gein was clearly obsessed with various forms of transsexualism. Inside him burned a desire to become a woman. This was likely his personal vision of sex reassignment surgery, inspired by the biography of Lily Elbe that he had read earlier. He didn't intend to castrate himself, but believed he could achieve transformation by adding the missing flesh and skin to his own body. He would don this horrific suit made of human skin, parading around his house while pretending to be his mother, engaging in dialogues with himself. There existed a grotesque paradox in Ed Gein's consciousness. On one hand, he desperately tried to bring his mother back to the world of the living. On the other, she was the very woman who tortured and oppressed him more than anyone, whom he hated. This is why he cut and hacked bodies with such fury, stitching skin together to compensate for his aggression. There was no patience or precision involved, but gradually the dead bodies ran out. On November 16, 1957, he went to a hardware store owned by an elderly woman named Bernice Warden. Something about her clearly attracted Gein, her definite resemblance to his mother. He had visited the store the day before, inquiring about antifreeze prices. The next day, Gein returned, began examining rifles, and asked to see one of them. He pulled out pre-prepared cartridges, loaded the gun, and shot Bernice in the back of the head.
What did you have along with you that day?
I didn't get anything along. That's what.
There's a pistol, I suppose.
No, I couldn't carry the rifle in without anybody knows. But I took my antifreeze out, went in there afterwards.
Do you remember killing her?
That's what I can't remember.
It would be kind of hard to drag her out of the store, though, wouldn't it? She'd be quite a heavy woman, wouldn't she? Did you throw her over your shoulder?
I said it really like you, but
That dragged her out.
Do you remember carrying her in the truck?
that I couldn't sparkly.
You don't remember undressing her?
No, that's good. See what? If I hung her.
During interrogation, investigators also questioned Ed about cannibalism, asking if he intended to eat Bernice Worden's flesh. However, he was evasive and complained of memory problems. That same day, Bernice's son Frank returned from hunting. Entering the store, he was horrified to discover massive bloodstains everywhere. When police arrived, the sheriff asked if Frank had any suspects. Frank immediately named Gein, as a detailed receipt with his name lay on the cash register. That evening, Gein was arrested near a grocery store. It's also important to mention that in Judge Robert Golmar's book, it's noted that the sheriff had previously searched Gein's house, but found no evidence at that time. Gein himself would later confirm this in his final interview. "I saw Ed Gein sitting in the car. The store light was on at the doorway, and I could see him clearly. One of the store boys was sitting with him. I approached his car and said, 'Ed, I'd like to talk to you.' Ed got out and sat in the back seat of the car. I asked Ed to tell me where he had been from 6 a.m. until this moment. He began recounting his story, and then I said, 'Now let's go back to Worden's store and repeat everything again.' When he finished his second version, I said, 'Ed, you're telling a completely different story.' Ed blinked and said, 'Someone framed me.' I asked, 'Why would someone frame you?' He replied, 'Well, Mrs. Warden.' 'What about Mrs. Warden?' 'Well, she's dead, isn't she?' 'Dead? How do you know she's dead?' 'Well, I heard it.' 'And where did you hear about it?' 'I heard them talking about it.' At that moment I knew, and we took him." Rumors spread like wildfire, so authorities had to transport Gein on the floor of the car to keep him out of sight. There was a real danger of violence from enraged townspeople. The Washoe County Sheriff's Department was ordered to search the suspect's residence. 2 police cars, led by the sheriff, headed to Gein's farm. They first entered the summer kitchen attached to the main house. Breaking down the door, the police began examining the room, shining flashlights into every corner as they searched. Then one officer stumbled upon something and directed his beam of light toward it. There hung the half-gutted body of Bernice Worden. Mrs. Worden had been stripped naked, her body gutted and eviscerated exactly as hunters process a deer. Her head was severed at the shoulder level. Gein had sliced the skin behind her ankles and inserted a sharpened wooden stake, 3 to 5 feet long and about 4 inches in diameter. We noticed that beneath the body, on the dirty floor, there were only a few drops of blood. It became clear the body had been gutted elsewhere. There was no sign of the head or internal organs nearby. We continued searching the house, which was in a state of complete disarray. Bones, papers, trash, clothing fragments, barrels, and debris littered the floor everywhere. We climbed to the second floor, which surprisingly wasn't as cluttered as the first. There, in a box, they found a human skull. Someone speculated it might belong to Mary Hogan, who disappeared in 1954. Marty found an automatic revolver under Gein's pillow in the bedroom. It would later be identified as the murder weapon used on Mary Hogan. Behind the bedroom door, they discovered a plastic bag containing a decomposing head. Skulls were mounted on the edges of Gein's bed. In the house, they also found a box containing 4 severed noses. What kind of individual could create something like this? I felt a sensation I'd never experienced in my entire life, because I'd never seen anything like it before. It was simply horrific. We found skulls and masks made from human skin, packaged in plastic bags. We discovered a box containing female organs, which I noticed were tied with golden ribbon. We found leg bones and a chair whose seat was stretched with human skin, tightly pulled, but if you looked underneath, you could see strips of fat. There were also little legs with handles made from bones, a lampshade from skin, bowls from skulls, and a belt made from nipples. One of the most bizarre finds was a suit made from pieces of female torso and waist skin. The suit also had a horrific addition, a vagina and anus neatly sewn on the sides. Gein said he would wear this suit at night and dance in his yard. Behind the kitchen door lay a paper bag. I picked it up with one hand. It was heavy, difficult to make out what was inside. Some hair. When I pulled it out and shone the flashlight, Marty took the mask in his hand and said, "My God, this is Mary Hogan." But where was Mrs. Warden's head? It was nowhere to be seen. We decided to search more thoroughly in the summer kitchen. There were 2 mattresses stacked on top of each other. When we lifted one corner, we saw a bag, and inside it, we found the sought-after head. 2 nails bent into hooks had been driven into her ears with pieces of rope tied to them. No one knows exactly what plans Gein had for this monstrous trophy. Maybe he wanted to nail it to his bed's headboard or hang it on the living room wall. In the kitchen, we found a coffee can filled with chewed chewing gum. And it wouldn't be so bad if there was just one, but there were about 200 of them. It seemed Gein threw nothing away. By the way, during his interrogation, Gein always took a break for chewing gum. Besides the gum, cracked and yellowed dentures were displayed on the shelves like Fabergé eggs. And in the sink, there was sand. During the search, we also found a shoebox containing 9 excised vulvas, one of which looked particularly fresh. A more thorough examination revealed that Gein had salted them. On the kitchen stove lay a frying pan with Mrs. Warden's heart, next to a glass filled with antifreeze. In the living room was a medical book. Surprisingly, the pages were clean, except for 2, showing a head and female genitalia. The only room in the house that differed from all the others was his mother Gein's room. It was boarded up. Inside, everything was covered in dust, but there was no mess.
The nighttime search was long and grueling. By then, rain had started outside, followed by snow. Working with Gein wasn't easy. He didn't fully understand where he was or what was happening. He confessed to the crimes inconsistently, sometimes insisting they were accidents. During interrogation, he tried to please his questioners, attempting to shift blame and justify his actions. Gein denied that his trophies, faces and heads, vulvas and breasts, noses and lips, skin and bones that littered his hellish dwelling were remains of murder victims. He insisted he wasn't a mad maniac, that Mrs. Warden's death was an accident. When asked if he had taken anyone else's life besides Bernice, Eddie shook his head and added,
"I don't think so. No."
What do you think about Mrs. Warden?
I liked her, in that way. She was nice. I thought she resembled my mother. Her height and everything else was similar. Even her cheekbones were very much alike.
Did you feel the same about Mary Hogan
as you did about Bernice.
Yes, that's true.
What did you feel?
Every time I went to her place, she was always friendly and welcoming.
Right. And what was similar between Mary Hogan and your mother?
That friendliness, and thinking about it now, I believe she was the same height and overall very similar.
Could you have taken Mary and put her into a coffin that already contained another woman?
I could have.
Gein told Wilimowski that between 1950 and 1954, he had dug up 9 or 10 bodies from 3 different cemeteries.
You see,
Gein said.
I didn't take all of them. Some I put back.
He also revealed that sometimes he only removed certain parts he needed and left the rest of the body in the grave. Gein was questioned about the disappearance of several other women, but he denied any involvement. During the trial, Gein would claim that he never hunted deer because he couldn't stand the sight of blood. However, neighbors testified otherwise. He had offered them venison several times. This didn't help his case, especially since he had coldly gutted Mrs. Warden.
You told me you removed certain parts of flesh, correct?
yes,
Which parts did you remove?
the head.
The head? What about the vagina?
Well, that, not always.
When you removed the head, did you first cut it and then break it off?
I think I just broke it off.
So you would shake it back and forth and then separate it, like breaking a piece of wire in 2.
That's a good description. I never brought a saw with me to the cemetery.
To give you some context, during the recording of this transcript, Gein was eating a piece of apple pie with cheese on top, complaining that the cheese was dried out. Wilimowski also questioned Gein about his thoughts regarding sex.
Have you ever thought about removing your penis and having female genitals instead?
Well, partially true.
And which part is true?
That I wanted to remove part of myself.
Does that part refer to your penis?
Well, not exactly. I mean, I thought about it earlier, when I was younger.
Ed, did you ever have thoughts about taking a part from women, mainly a vagina, and placing it over your penis to cover it?
I think that's true.
Do you recall? Did you ever actually do anything like that with vaginas from those women's bodies?
I think... Yes, I remember, that's true.
Were there similarities in those faces to your mother?
I think there were.
What about the faces? Did you wear faces over your own?
That I did, yes. I'm sure of it. Parts like the eyes, and those parts of the head. They were just portions of the head itself, maybe 2 or 3 of them.
Do you remember how you held the faces over your own?
I think with string.
Do you think you would wear that other face for a long period of time?
Not too long. I had things to do, after all. Maybe an hour or so.
Did you ever wear women's underwear over your body and then put one of those vaginas over your penis?
That's possible.
So you separated the skin from the skull and disposed of everything inside the head, correct?
That's right.
What about preserving the flesh?
From part of that skin. Possibly. From those women. I think I used oil to keep the skin soft. You understand?
Which woman are we talking about?
The one missing the top part. The one that... Mrs. Adams.
Okay. What kind of oil did you use?
Penetrating oil.
Did you wear rubber gloves?
With Mary Hogan, I think I did.
Do you think this looks like a flayed breast?
That's right.
They wouldn't happen to be from Mary, would they?
I think so, as far as I remember.
How did you remove them? With a scalpel?
I did it with a pocket knife. One with a big blade.
These skulls, did you intend to use them as containers?
I think you've got my idea right. I figured it was like in the old Norse style. Those old songs they used to sing. They must have used skulls to drink from. What was that drink called? Mead.
Now, what about the wastebasket? What's it made of?
It's made of human skin.
It looks like this thing here was made from a leg, or maybe two. Did you sew them together in two places?
That's sort of from the one that came from the grave.
What about the facial masks?
When I made those masks, you see, I stuffed them with paper so they could dry out. For the vagina, well, you know, I sprinkled a little salt on it. It started turning green.
Why did you paint this particular vagina with silver aluminum paint?
Yes, I painted it over with paint to see if it would keep that way.
Did you open the coffins completely, or only halfway?
Halfway.
And then you pulled the body out?
That's right.
Gein was asked if anyone had ever come to the cemetery while he was there. He said it happened once, a couple of lovers. He crouched down and stayed inside the grave, certain they hadn't seen him. He also mentioned feeling a strange, almost pleasant thrill while digging. The judge remarked that Gein seemed to prefer older, more developed women, meaning, of course, the dead. Ed officially had only 2 murders on record, at least those we know of and could prove. Bernice Warden and Mary Hogan, the owner of a local bar who vanished under strange circumstances. Investigators later determined that Mary had been killed in her bar. They found spent shell casings and a trail of blood leading to the door. Mary Hogan disappeared on December 8, 1954. But with time passing and no new evidence, the case went cold, until Bernice's murder revived it. During interrogations, Gein even joked that Mary Hogan was hiding on his farm, a remark dismissed as his morbid sense of humor. But during the search, a deputy sheriff discovered a paper bag. When he opened it, he pulled out a human face, still attached to a clump of hair. And everyone immediately recognized Mary Hogan. In 1950s America, especially in small towns, people were utterly unprepared to comprehend such horror. The idea that something like this could happen right under their noses. What had happened seemed beyond human capability. Only the devil himself could be responsible. The revelation that Ed had robbed graves shocked the deeply religious townspeople even more than the murders. It touched the most primitive chords of their souls. They could not comprehend that the bodies of their loved ones had been desecrated in such a way. Unlike many figures associated with serial crime and perversion, Ed wasn't attached to material things at all. This was best illustrated by an incident on his farm, when unidentified vandals smashed the windows and set the place on fire. His family farm burned completely to the ground. All Gein could say in response was,
It's for the best.
It showed how completely detached he was from the world around him. Plainfield was a tiny town, cut off from civilization in the middle of Wisconsin. Even within the state, few had ever heard of it. But suddenly, because of Ed Gein's crimes, the town gained horrific notoriety. Reporters flooded in by the dozens. The news hit like a bombshell. Before long, Gein's name appeared in the pages of Life magazine, an incredible feat for the time, followed by a major article in Time. It showed just how fascinated the public had become with Ed Gein. Some were quick to seize the opportunity, eager to get their names in the papers, give interviews, and claim they'd always known something was wrong with him. They even offered their photos for publication. But Plainfield's sense of decency was outraged by the terrible wounds Ed had inflicted on the town. Every small community has its little reason to be proud, a local celebrity, a famous birth. But Plainfield immediately became known as the town that had given birth to a monster, Ed Gein. There's something not so widely known. The term serial killer wouldn't enter common usage until many years after these horrific events. Many serial killers are profoundly disturbed, yet they understand what they are doing and can be eerily rational about it. You could say they follow their own horrifying code, utterly devoid of moral or human values. With no trace of compassion, they see other people as objects to be used for their perverse ends. It's impossible to feel any sympathy for figures like Spesivtsev, see the video on my channel or via the link in the description, or John Wayne Gacy. They were monsters. Even though Gein was ultimately labeled a monster because of his horrific practices, there were still kind-hearted people who felt pity for him. Psyches like Gein's, when left unexposed to suffering or treatment, only rarely reach their final, most dangerous form. Gein was not, in the everyday sense, a long-term schizophrenic. Schizophrenia more commonly appears in adolescence or early adulthood. Gein appeared largely normal until his late 30s, until the death of his mother. Only after that did the chain of brutal acts begin. As later found in the forensic psychiatric examination, his mind had become severely disordered. He suffered persistent auditory, tactile, and visual hallucinations. For example, there were episodes in which he spent hours running from the imagined floating head of his mother, which he said screamed and cursed at him, while he crawled through bushes and woods trying to hide. Further inquiry revealed pathological aspects of his childhood and upbringing, and arrested development socially and sexually. In many serial killers, there is an inner, impulsive child that acts on sudden urges. Society and civilization are supposed to care for and treat such individuals. But in Gein's case, nobody did. Beyond the sexual gratification that motivated some of these crimes, many killers reach a peak of satisfaction in the act of killing itself. Murder can be an extreme means of obtaining ultimate pleasure, and of taking another person's life. Types like Ed Gein fascinate us because they seem irresistible. Their crimes are so horrific that our minds reject them. They touch some primitive chord in the human psyche, the primeval, instinctive strings that underpin old legends and fairy tales. Across cultures, folklore warns of places you must never enter: caves, forests, houses. And in those dark corners, we imagine rooms where dismembered bodies hang on hooks. That horror becomes story, and in that sense, the monster stands at our door. A grim reminder that, if we are not vigilant, we may be the next to be caught unawares. Ed Gein became a monster, and almost overnight, a figure of new folklore and modern myth. His image took on many forms, mostly in the shape of crude jokes. It wasn't funny, but in 1950s Wisconsin, such jokes existed. There was something about this story that stuck, something that made people want to talk about it again and again. To give you an idea, the judge's book on Ed Gein even includes an entire chapter titled Gein-Style Humor. It reads, "Residents of all ages weren't above joking. For example, before Christmas break, children could be heard singing,
'On Christmas Eve in silent halls, the school stands empty, not even a soul. Teachers hang by their necks, waiting for Ed Gein to come.'"
Take, for example, the novel Psycho, by the renowned writer Robert Bloch, who lived in Wisconsin during the 1950s when Gein's story was making headlines. If you've read Psycho, you'll recall that after Norman Bates' arrest, people compared him to Ed Gein. The character of Norman Bates created by Bloch, is much closer to Gein than the portrayal in Hitchcock's film. Bloch himself said that many believed the novel was entirely based on the real-life serial killer Ed Gein, whose life inspired the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. However, the novel only had an indirect connection to Gein's life and crimes. Bloch himself explained,
"The first Psycho was based on the situation. At the time, I didn't know much about Gein himself. I knew he lived in a small town of 800 people. I lived 50 miles away in another small town of 1,200 people, and I understood it was the kind of place where if you sneezed in the northern part of town, someone in the southern part would say, 'Bless you.' So I knew that a man had committed monstrous murders in a small town, lived there his whole life, and nobody suspected a thing. That situation made me suspect there was more to it, a story behind it. Based on that story, I wrote the novel. Only later, after the character of Norman Bates was created, did I realize how closely he resembled the real Ed Gein."
This once again shows how our twisted imaginations can create the perfect scenario, where dreams, desires, and reality collide. Just as Nabokov once noted about Lolita, when he was accused of reflecting real-life events. Bloch later went on to write 2 more Psycho novels. When asked why, he replied,
"The world has changed. When I wrote the first Psycho, serial killings were extremely rare. They were anomalies, exotic if you will. Today, it's commonplace. You open a newspaper, turn on the TV, and hear about the monstrous acts of yet another killer. It happens everywhere, across the country, around the world, in the streets, even in schools. So I wondered, what would happen if Norman Bates returned to today's violent world? What would he think of it? And what would the world think of him?"
For obvious commercial reasons, Hitchcock cast a well-known and attractive actor for the role of Norman Bates. In Bloch's book, however, Bates is a man in his 40s, balding, overweight, and far from appealing. Hitchcock didn't want to portray an ordinary, forgettable man. By casting Anthony Perkins, whose appearance was nothing like Bloch's Bates, he created a new kind of maniac, one who was disturbingly attractive. It was the birth of an icon, the image of the nice neighbor who greets you in the morning, shares an elevator with you, or passes by while you're walking your dog. Psycho was released in the 1960s, but the film didn't truly capture the spirit of Gein's story. The book was steeped in the harsh atmosphere of oppressive Puritanism, contrasted with a vulgar fascination for lurid, sensational stories. That fractured, almost schizophrenic element at the heart of Gein's case was what both Bloch and Hitchcock drew upon in creating Psycho. The film took just 36 days to shoot. Later, the film industry would produce the series Bates Motel, only loosely connected to Gein's story, but a remarkably well-made show offering a completely different perspective on the Psycho myth. As for the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it accomplished something monumental. It recreated the crypt-like atmosphere that haunted Gein's home, capturing pure, unfiltered horror. Its power lies in the fact that it defies meaning. Our minds can't truly comprehend a family of cannibalistic killers. They shouldn't exist. And yet, there they are, right before your eyes. Somewhere deep in our subconscious, we feel a strange flicker of pity for Leatherface. A sense of self-recognition we also experience when we look at the seemingly normal face of a monster like Norman Bates, as portrayed by Anthony Perkins. The Leatherface clan is a grotesque comic book parody of a pathological family. And that's precisely why we feel pity for him, because we can imagine the environment that created him. The Silence of the Lambs, meanwhile, borrowed that infamous human skin suit, In both the film and the novel, we follow Buffalo Bill, a character who partially mirrors Gein's crimes and motivations, driven by a desperate desire to transform into a woman. And honestly, the cinematic works inspired by Ed Gein don't end there. They could be listed endlessly. So right now, on your screen, you'll see a selection of films that directors, screenwriters, and actors have acknowledged were inspired by Ed Gein's story and the horrors that unfolded in his home. Take a look and pick a movie for yourself. Another fascinating aspect is how Ed Gein continues to influence modern culture. What you see here is a painting by one of America's most renowned outsider artists, Joe Coleman. Coleman is known for depicting serial killers and criminal figures, and Ed Gein is among them. The artist studied Gein's life in great detail. If you look closely at the canvas, you'll notice the covers of the horror magazines Gein used to read. The painting is filled with quotes from police reports and religious texts. The borders of the artwork echo the medieval Dance of Death motif, while the text on the frame is an expanded version of a darkly humorous children's song about Ed Gein. As Coleman himself notes, he feels a certain connection to Gein, sharing similar maternal obsessions and a fascination with collecting criminal and grotesque artifacts. One of these artifacts is a letter from Gein himself, written from the hospital.
Ed Gein truly resembles a shaman. He delves into the darkest corners of his psyche, exploring the most shadowy parts of his soul, those tied to necrophilia and his conflicted sense of gender. He wears a woman's skin, merging with both his mother and the dead. He performs these acts in solitude, midnight rituals surrounded by grotesque, homemade artifacts, as though they were totems to forgotten gods. Like a shaman, in his own deranged way, he reflects the trauma his tribe has endured. Gein mirrors the journey of our metaphorical tribe, the dark underbelly of our own culture. Like Albert Fish, he becomes a grotesque reflection of society's hidden horrors.
There's a bitter irony in how a serial killer can become a kind of folk hero. These people commit acts we could never bring ourselves to do, crossing taboos, norms, and moral boundaries. Yet we can imagine them, because dark thoughts live in everyone. The difference is that we do not act on them. As Sigmund Freud wrote, the virtuous man contents himself with dreaming that which the wicked man does in actual life. Such individuals step beyond the fantasies and prejudices that most of us keep inside. In that extraordinary transgression lies their appeal. It's an exaggeration, of course, but these figures come to embody a perverse kind of personal freedom, a warped reflection of the core drives of human character. They break the rules, and for that reason so many are fascinated by them. Gein becomes, in a sense, the seed of the modern psychopath, a creature of a new era. They are the monsters that haunt childhood fears, slipping into us through our most primitive channels of consciousness. To strip the skin from a human face and wear it as your own is among the most harrowing acts in human history. While our attention is captivated and our gaze is fixed on him, Ed Gein secures a place in world history. After his arrest in November 1957, he underwent forensic psychiatric evaluations. During this time, while Edward Gein was in a mental health facility for examination, he gave statements about digging up his victims' graves. The authorities began verifying his claims. Evidence confirmed that the graves had indeed been exhumed by Gein's hands. Some of the women whose bodies were desecrated were known to Edward during their lifetimes. Further investigation was deemed unnecessary. It was clear his confessions were truthful, and sufficient evidence had been gathered to prove it. The psychiatric evaluation concluded on January 6, 1958, caused profound shock. Edward Gein was diagnosed with schizophrenia and sexual perversion. His homosexuality, combined with necrophilia, according to the doctors, further confirmed that Gein could not stand trial for sentencing. Instead, he was to continue treatment in a psychiatric facility for an indefinite period.
The United States Supreme Court has held that a man who is insane or is not competent to stand trial can't waive anything. And I know for the layman this may be difficult to understand. My point is, I want to make sure that when the ruling is made that he's competent, or as sure as I can, that he is, so that everything that transpires after that, including what has transpired today, the appointment of counsel and everything else, cannot be attacked later by Mr. Gein or an attorney representing him, that he was not, on the grounds that he was not competent to make those decisions.
I felt as a lawyer, despite the publicity of this case and what people may think, I, as an attorney, have an obligation to discharge my duties to each and every client, and I feel that's my obligation, and I'm happy to serve with Mr. Belter, whom I consider a very highly competent attorney.
I believe Mr. Gein suffers from a chronic, long-developing form of schizophrenia. Furthermore, I don't believe he's capable of consulting with his attorney or understanding the proceedings. In my professional opinion, he is legally insane.
Mr. Gein is neither intellectually impaired nor mentally deficient. However, he suffers from a chronic mental illness. Nevertheless, he is able to cooperate with his attorney, and therefore he is legally sane.
So, Doctor, you're saying that medically he's insane, but legally he's sane. Is that right?
Yes.
Based on the diagnosis, the doctor's analyses, and his heinous acts, it became clear that Ed would never return to his former life. A decision was made to compensate the families of his victims through an auction held on March 30th, 1958, where all of Edward's belongings were sold. Reading about how he behaved in the psychiatric facility, one might think he was incapable of feeling remorse. But later, you'll see that's not entirely true. The frenzy surrounding Gein began to fade. Isolated from society for life, he gradually disappeared from media headlines as new figures took the spotlight. However, 5 years after his confinement, in 1962, a group of journalists became interested in him again. In collaboration with local authorities, they proposed showcasing Ed and his living conditions to the public. In late November 1962, Ed was presented to the public, clean, shaved, and well-fed. He looked like an ordinary, average citizen with a seemingly stable psyche. It was hard to see the bloodthirsty maniac in his face. Gein was strikingly different from the man who entered the facility, and according to the doctors, he caused them no trouble. Despite being put on display for a large audience, Gein was pleasantly surprised by the attention, as evidenced by his eagerness to cooperate with reporters and share details about his treatment. It was clear he took pleasure in being able to engage in his beloved woodworking, which was part of his therapeutic activities. On November 7, 1968, Edward Theodore Gein was convicted.
You worked on the defense 10 years ago, and you have met Mr. Gein again now after 10 years. How does he appear to you? Has he changed any?
Oh, he looked somewhat healthier. He seemed a rather dark and gaunt personage 10 years ago. He seems more like a middle-aged businessman at this time.
Mr. LeGrand, what has the announcement of Mr. Gein's apparent retrial done to the city of Plainfield?
Shock is probably the best word. It brought back many memories that we thought had been forgotten and hope to be able to forget permanently.
After extensive treatment and an updated diagnosis, it was determined that Gein's mental state had stabilized, and he was fully aware of both his surroundings and the crimes he had committed.
When I expressed my desire to speak with Gein, Dr. Schubert told me that Gein had refused to talk to other reporters, but he would ask if Ed was willing to meet with me. To my surprise, he agreed. He looked heavier than I remembered. He was friendly, smiling, and laughing throughout the interview.
I was asked to write a book about your case, and that's what I'm working on now. I have all the old transcripts and everything. I thought it would be good to come here and talk to you. You're not obligated, but I'd like to know if there's anything you want to share, anything you'd like to say for the book.
Well, a lot has happened since the sheriff died. I think you know it was all covered up.
As far as I know, on the night of your arrest, when they took you to jail, the sheriff slammed your head against the wall. Is that true? That wasn't exactly great on his part.
Besides that night they kept me awake, and half the next day too. They interrogated me, asking about this and that. It was like the old days. They used that 3rd degree, or whatever it's called. The only thing they didn't use was a bright lamp to shine in my eyes.
I recall when you were in Madison, they fed you. I remember a moment when you were brought apple pie with cheese on top, and you said it was dried out. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah. They also had pumpkin pie. I didn't care much for it.
Ed, someone told me, or I read somewhere, that since you've been here, you started making jewelry out of stones. Is that true?
I used to do that, yeah. Now I'm working as an electrician. I was at Dr. Schubert's house, fixing things up there.
Everyone in Woshara County always spoke of you as a hard worker.
Well, my jewelry was all sold off by volunteers for $50. I made some nice pieces worth about $100, silver bracelets and such, but it all went for $50.
Are you still making that kind of jewelry?
Not anymore. Now I work as an electrician, carpenter, fixing roofs, and things like that.
Those crafts you made, they're all sold?
Yep, every single one. Each was worth at least $100. I also helped the guys downstairs with carpeting. Why did I step in to help and show them how it's done? I knew how to sew carpets.
How old are you?
65.
You're a kid compared to me. I'm 70.
Haha, you got me beat by a whole 5 years.
How's your health? Everything okay?
Honestly, it's good.
So tell me, in general, do they treat you well here? Not just you, but all the patients. Do they feed you well?
The food's good. Everything else is good too.
Do you miss Woshara County?
Not really.
Were you happy living there, Ed?
Well, I wouldn't call it a happy life. I had a ton of debts, had to work hard to pay them off, and that's when I let the house go. I was under constant stress.
I recently met with your old friends, the Hills. Do you remember them?
Of course.
Mrs. Hill told me that the last time you had dinner at their place, you played checkers with one of her boys afterward.
Maybe. I don't quite remember now.
Well, Ed, is there anything else you'd like to say for my book about this case?
There is. You probably remember the sheriff said he was at my house, searched it with his guys, and found nothing, right?
Yeah.
You know I wasn't there then. I can prove it. I was at the Hills the whole time. It's a bit puzzling, isn't it? They search my house and find no evidence. But then they search again, and suddenly find everything. And I wasn't even there.
Sure, it was dark, it was night, and they didn't have flashlights, so they couldn't conduct a proper search.
Well, they should have had flashlights for a proper search.
Did you have electricity at your farm?
No. And they showed up without a search warrant. They should have gotten a warrant first.
Do you still read a lot?
Yeah, interesting stuff. Newspapers. I keep up with the latest events. Some of the guys here don't bother. They don't even read the papers. But you gotta know what's going on in the world, you know. I listen to the news on the radio, shortwave, so I can hear what's happening out there.
But you still read a lot, right?
Well, I read what's educational and interesting. There's a lot of science fiction here I can't stomach. It's fine for kids, not for a grown man.
You've got a nice library here, don't you?
Right.
Well, Ed, thank you for agreeing to talk. I'll include include our entire conversation in the book, and I'm sure you and Dr. Ann too will have plenty of pleasant visitors in the coming years.
Following the release of this information, investigators were given the green light to continue the legal proceedings concerning the deaths of the two women. However, due to the court's ruling, Ed was returned to a psychiatric hospital, as the judge acknowledged that the crimes had been committed under the influence of severe mental illness. Gein later filed an appeal, seeking to have himself declared legally sane. After lengthy deliberation, the appeal was denied in April 1974. A particularly curious note appeared later in Ed's medical records. Staff at the mental health institution reported that he behaved oddly around women. The older Gein grew, the more pronounced this behavior became. He would become visibly uneasy or even freeze when faced with women. Edward Theodore Gein spent his final day on July 26, 1984. He died of asphyxia, having been previously diagnosed with leukemia during treatment. He was buried on July 28th beside his mother, Augusta Gein. For years, his gravestone was repeatedly vandalized by souvenir hunters. In 2000, most of the headstone was stolen, and in June 2001, it was finally restored. Now, let's talk about the mental state of Edward Theodore Gein. Ed is perhaps the most extreme example of a hothouse for cultivating mental disorders. His case demonstrates that some mental illnesses are not just acquired, but can be deeply influenced by environment, even if there's a hereditary component. First, he was the youngest child. Typically, younger children receive the most parental attention, often being pampered and cared for. But in Augusta Gein's mind, pampering meant strict discipline, torment, and imposing rigid church dogmas. More crucially, she instilled her personal interpretations of religious texts, ideas of a sinful, lustful world, where the only safe haven was under her control. I've mentioned before the duality of Ed's relationship with his mother. Hatred mixed with idolatry toward Augusta, who represented the sole image of a sinless woman in his eyes. This completely stunted his personal and, importantly, sexual development. We all discover our sexual identity by understanding our gender, recognizing the opposite sex and their differing anatomy, experiencing attraction to certain genders, and progressing through milestones like a first masturbatory act and eventual normative sexual experiences. But for Gein, everything went wrong on all fronts. The chains and labels imposed by his mother left him utterly confused about himself and the world around him. His first arousal came from watching a pig being slaughtered. His first masturbation led to being scalded with boiling water. His attraction to women morphed into a phobia, and his understanding of his own gender descended into complete latency and asexuality. Ed's brother Henry, less affected by their mother's influence, managed to develop more normally and even started a relationship, nearly escaping her control. He might have pulled Ed out of this bondage, but his tragic death in an accident left Ed with no chance of rescue. Then came the loss of his central deity, his mother. This triggered a domino effect, collapsing every structure of his existence. Let me remind you, at the time of Augusta's death, Ed was 39 years old, a stagnant period for self-discovery. This wasn't about childish experimentation anymore. Books on anatomy, comics, and stories filled the gaps in his understanding of gender, body structure, and male-female interactions. Notably, his developmental stunting is well illustrated by how effortlessly he connected with children, always finding common ground with them when babysitting, captivating them with stories. But his fantasies of male-female interaction weren't what you might imagine. He dreamed of dismemberment, burning at the stake, and digging up corpses. These were the relationships he read about, and they seemed normal to him. His obsession with resurrecting his mother consumed his mind. From this point, he began robbing the graves of elderly women. At the same time, he studied anatomy, projected his resentment toward his mother, and created his collection, including the infamous suit representing his idealized self, a shield against his mother because it made him her. In wearing it, he achieved harmony with himself. But as time passed, the bodies weren't enough, and he had a plan to fulfill. Remember when I mentioned his apparent lack of emotion? It's not quite that. It's something else. The only 2 murders he committed weren't driven by sexual or fetishistic motives. He simply needed skin to complete his work. He killed his victims like a hunter would a deer, a clean shot to the back of the head to preserve the hide. Even his method of dismemberment mirrored dressing a deer or doe, letting the blood drain. When caught, he didn't panic because it barely mattered to him. Everything around him had felt unreal since his mother's death. His world collapsed like a house of cards, and his illness pressed harder. Hallucinations, voices, fears. This is why, when told his house and all his creations had burned down, he was utterly unfazed. Today, you're looking at a truly mentally incompetent serial killer, unlike the others I've discussed, incapable of being held fully accountable for his actions. He was clearly diagnosed with schizophrenia and sexual perversions, influenced by 3 distinct pathologies: latent homosexuality, necrophilia, and gender dysphoria. These perversions intertwined in ways that are nearly impossible to untangle, especially given the lack of objective biographical data about his life and those close to him. But crucially, he didn't sexually assault the corpses or eat the bodies, an important distinction, as sexually, he remained stuck at the developmental stage of a 5 to 8-year-old. Sex was irrelevant to him. He didn't even know how it worked. Curiously, his mother stayed with him forever. Even at the end of his life, in the comfort of the psychiatric facility, he remained terrified of women. His home, filled with the remains of 15 women, was like a shrine of totems warding off evil spirits. That's all for today. But before we wrap up, I just want to say this. YouTube no longer monetizes content like this. If you enjoy these videos and want to see more, consider supporting the channel. There's a link in the description below. Don't forget to leave a comment, hit that like button, and while you're waiting for the next episode, check out my other videos, subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching till the end. This is Room 13, signing off.